Yeah, Mary is.
Back there? Okay. Okay, looks like we're live. I'll call the meeting to order and I'll take attendance. Mary Craig, she hear us? The other Mary. Not responding. Well, I can tell she's here.
Mary, you're on mute.
No,
Oh, there we go.
present.
Thank you.
I couldn't hear anything from you.
Spiro,
Here.
myself, Dawn,
Yep.
George.
Yep.
I don't see anybody else online from the committee. Okay. First,
Lee Britton, I'm sorry. Not Lee Britton.
Lee Rowley?
Lee Rowley.
How did I miss him? Oh, it's just a picture?
Just this picture.
Here he is.
Lee Rowley, you're here apparently.
Lee, you're muted.
I can see him
Here.
Okay. OPM update, project status and schedule.
Lou's with us remotely.
All right, yeah, I'm sorry I can't be there today in person, but I've asked Laura to hand out my progress report. So back in mid-December, we received the 30% design for the water resource reclamation facility, resource recovery facility. And then on the 15th, we held on November, we received the design. On the 14th, we held a workshop which went through, where CDM Smith went through a number of cost savings alternatives. They presented some action items to the town regarding the cost saving items and the OPM. We've reviewed some of those, made some recommendations to the town on the way they should proceed with some of those cost saving items. In total, I believe there was about $4 million of cost savings presented in the alternatives. Not all the savings alternatives were accepted or were to the town's advantage at this time, but they were discussed in detail, and we went through them. Related to the collection system, again, we received the 60% design. On December 13th, there was a meeting held between the town, CDM Smith. We participated as observers, and the Mass DOT regarding the TIP funding. And it appears that some of the funding for the Route 28 improvements may be further down the line than the plan is for the collection system schedule. So that's something that the town's going to have to address as to the means of putting that contract out to bid prior to the Route 28 improvements being completed, or in concert with the Route 28 improvements. In addition, on the collection system, just last week, we received a pump station alternatives memo that I believe some of the committee members have reviewed and commented on. We're in the process of reviewing that as well. And we have some comments, and we're going to try to schedule a separate meeting with the designers and the staff to review some of those alternatives. Some good news that was received back on December 16th, the 2023 Clean Water SRF Draft Intended Use Plan was released by Mass DEP. Yarmouth had the highest ranking on the IUP. So that's good, because and it was for the full amount of the $200+ million. So that puts the town in a good position to receive that SRF funding. And then regarding some action items that we're in the process of doing, we're completing our comments on the 30% review of the 30% design documents. We're in the midst of the 60% review of the collection system. And as I mentioned, the comments on the pumping station. So a lot of material has come in end of November, December, and even as of early as last week. So we're busy trying to get our comments back to the designer, keep them on schedule, as well as to the comments back to staff and to the committee. That's everything I have.
Okay. Any
Kurt?
questions? Anybody on that?
Joe?
Okay. I don't see a separate agenda item for that pump station memo that went out. Was that included in what you just presented now, and that's it?
We'll talk, number two, I think when CDM Smith does their update,
Will
we'll
be
get
part of that.
Part of the collection system update, we have a few slides on that.
All right, then you're up.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, Mike Judici, CDM Smith, Dave Young is here as well as several members of our design team. So we'll give you a quick update on where we stand with the design. I don't know if Matt or Bill, if you want to take it
Sure.
on the treatment plant.
Yeah, sure, Mike. Can I just assume that,
Presentation?
that's what I was just going to ask. Yeah, I see it. I believe it's being shared on the screen now, and I can assume that folks in the room are able to see this.
Yes.
So just commenting on the WRF design update, some of which Lou just touched on. The draft 30% design submittal was made in late November on the 29th there, and the review workshop was held on the 14th of December. At that workshop, we discussed, our primary focus was discussing a number of potential cost savings items, which we'll get into in a little bit more depth. But, you know, at present, we are awaiting conclusion of the value engineering review from basically comments on the 30% submittal and any value engineering ideas from the OPM and the town. Once we get that, we will move to finalize the 30% submittal. So preliminary design report and drawings associated therewith, and begin moving towards the 60% milestone. There's a couple of slides here just to show you what's going on at the WRF and where we are with progress.
Excuse me, there's
yes.
nothing on the screen. The screen is not being shared for the people that are zooming in.
Okay, what I'm able to see, Mary, is the Town of Yarmouth's Zoom host is sharing it.
Well,
know.
it flashed up on the screen momentarily and then it came down. So there's nothing up there now.
Mary, if you look at the gallery,
If you're in
Yes.
the gallery, you should be able to pin Town of Yarmouth Zoom host.
Okay, thank you. That worked. Thank you.
No, thank you, Mary. Appreciate it. Wanted to make sure everyone's seeing it. So hopefully everybody is looking at this now. This is the overall site layout of the WRF and what we've been working with. I don't want to spend too much time getting into the nitty gritty necessarily, but what you can see here, rather than talk about north, south, east, west, I'll talk about top of sheet, bottom of sheet. At sort of the bottom of sheet, you can see there's 4 large tanks. Those are the sequencing batch reactors. To the left of that is the process building, which houses a number of staff functions, the lab building, locker rooms, et cetera. And then in the basement houses, or I should say lower level houses, the blowers for sequencing batch reactors. On the right side of those sequencing batch reactors, you'll see additional tankage. That's an equalization tank coming out of the SBRs, and then denitrification filters. Up above that arrow on the right is the UV disinfection facility. You can see that there's that gray road is exactly that, a road that would loop around the facility. And sort of to the left side of that loop is the headworks and the solids handling components of the WRF. So just wanted to give a general feel for the layout. To the right of all that, and it's south if you're thinking of directions relative to Buck Island Road, are the infiltration basins for this site. Those arrows indicate on the following slides some perspectives that we've prepared. So as part of the model that we're developing, just to give you a sense of what this facility might look like, obviously these tools are pretty helpful along those lines. So up on the top, you have a view of the closest thing to you is the denitrification facilities. So the kind of the tanks on the left on the top portion of this slide, with the building right in front of you, that's where some of the chemical is stored for various processes at the plant. And sort of in the background of that slide, the top half of the sheet, and then at the bottom, more in the foreground, are the sequencing batch reactors themselves. So you can see it's relatively large tankage where all of the process happens, where we achieve the majority of our nitrogen removal, pulling sludge, in this case, technically primary sludge and WAS out, et cetera. So if you go to the next slide, just the last perspective that we've prepared, at least for this presentation, there are certainly more. This is just a view of the process building. So this is kind of what you see, if you can imagine, as you're driving up that road coming off of Buck Island Road. To the left would be the existing water facility, and this would be kind of straight ahead. So this would be, again, where most of the, when personnel aren't necessarily out working on the plant itself, this is where they would spend their time in terms of laboratory, locker rooms, offices, et cetera. And then in the basement of this facility are the blowers for the SBRs. So things progressing well. Looking forward to getting the comments on the 30% submittal and moving to the 60% mark for March is when we're aiming to have that in.
All right, thanks, Matt. If there are any questions on the resource recovery facility?
I have one, just in terms of perspective, the second slide there where you're looking the perspective views, what are the heights that we're looking at approximately? What's the elevation, I guess, if that's the proper way to
Sure.
ask it?
The larger tankage that's out of ground has, I guess, what we'd call a reveal, right? Because the tanks go deeper than adjacent grade by a fair amount, but that reveal shown is roughly about 10 feet, maybe 12 feet for some of the tankage. It depends where specifically you're standing, but somewhere in that neighborhood. That chemical building itself, obviously, you can see is a little higher, maybe by a factor of about 8 feet. So there's essentially a story on top of or relative to the tankage. So, that might add up to roughly 20 some odd feet. I'm going to answer the question that you just asked for the building, but I want to look it up to be a little more accurate. When I say the building, I mean the process building closest to the entrance. I'm pulling that up, but I would say somewhere in the scale of probably about 16 feet-ish to the top of the roof line itself.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Anybody else have any questions on that? Okay, I guess we can move forward.
So just give you a quick update on the collection system design. Lou touched on some of these as well. As he said, we submitted the 60% submittal at the end of November. The drilling program started first week in December, and as of last Friday, they've completed 56 out of 109 borings, so roughly 50% done at this point. A few more weeks. They took a little time off around the holidays, so a few more weeks of drilling, and then we'll wrap that up. So we're shooting toward the 90% submittal, slated for the middle of February. That's the next design milestone. As Lou mentioned, we did have a call with MassDOT, with town staff, just to get an update on, as you know, there are two projects along Route 28 that we had been anticipating, including the sewer work in the roadway projects, the section from Barnstable to Parkers River that we call Route 28 West, and it corresponds with our Contract 5. The intersection project at Route 28, North Main Street and Old Main Street, and the Bass River Bridge is our Contract 4. And then there's a section between those two that comprise Contracts 2 and 3. So we walked through each of those projects with MassDOT, particularly on Contract 5. The 28 West project didn't receive the best news that we wanted to hear. It seems at this point that project is not programmed at the time being, so They don't have identified funding for that particular project. So we've talked about other alternatives in order to move the sewer work along and to meet the SRF schedule, including potentially having an early utility project, a Phase 1 project that we've discussed a little bit. And I know Jeff's had some conversations with them in the past. So at this point, that looks like maybe the best hope in terms of pushing that project along and meeting the SRF schedule. As a reminder, for SRF principal forgiveness, the construction contract for any of the work that's included in the SRF package would need to be executed by June 30th, 2024. So that's the time frame. You need a construction contract executed at that point in order to qualify for principal forgiveness. So that's the target date that we're trying to meet. So working back from that and based on that conversation, at least for the roadway project itself, it doesn't look like that would line up with the SRF schedule at this point. So that obviously was not,
Does anybody know how this all fell apart?
I think the project, we got the sense of
We
the,
were busting our hump to try and catch up with them, and all of a sudden, they're 5 to 6 years out at a minimum, it sounds like.
I think generally it has to do with the project cost increasing, and there was a identified point in which they had funds that were secured for the project, but as the cost of the project grew, that fell apart. They are still moving forward. There's a project manager assigned, Tom Courier from MassDOT. He's one of the people that was on the call with us, is moving it forward. There's just no identified funding for essentially a project that's in excess of $20 million. There was, to put some specifics to it, there was funding identified when it was $8 million. So it's a factor of it just project creep or the growth of the cost of the project. In addition, MassDOT has some concerns with the intersections and working through all of the details associated with the scoping of those intersections. There's an interest to have potential roundabouts at a couple of the key intersections along that corridor on the Route 28 West piece of the project that they need to work through as to whether those are the best scenarios, or would upgraded signals be better, or in one case, actually with Townbrook Road, installation of signals. So there's those types of complications that when the project started, it was a road resurfacing project, and now it's turned into a road improvement project. It's going to be a good project when it gets done. It's just that the timing has fallen behind what our wastewater project has. So as Mike mentioned, there are some possibilities. One is early utility phasing. Another one might be to take those intersections that I just mentioned that are a little more time-consuming or challenging and pull them out and do other parts of the project. So we're still looking for ways to work with MassDOT on that particular contract. We should be in, I know you haven't got to the next one yet, we should be in pretty good shape with regard to contract 4 as far as their timing goes. But there's a bridge associated with that contract 4 that needs to be done sooner rather than later. So they're on a pretty good schedule for that. It's just that 5th contract, we're working through what that looks like and how the best way to implement that would be. We still feel there's ways for us to work together with MassDOT. And then, of course, a absolute worst case scenario or fallback plan, if you will, would be for us to do it as a separate highway access permit as in contracts 2 and 3. But we're not there yet. We're still at the point where MassDOT was going to respond to some of our suggestions and let us know if those were feasible.
So our cost estimates right now include no assistance from them? Or do,
correct,
right, so we're just assuming they're not going to be there for anything?
correct.
Okay. Kind of a, related but not part of our problem here is that, the 2 properties at Great Island Plaza and the swimwear shop are both for sale. If anybody has a dream about realigning that intersection, well, we've talked about it for how many years?
At least 100.
This might be the time to do something.
And that's a good point. That's one of the 2 intersections that wasn't potentially slowing the project down. But if we do have a little bit more time to react in that overall project, that might be a good intersection to look at. The 2 intersections, of course, that I'm referring to are the Townbrook Road one and the East Main Street. Those are the 2 that are working through, that are identified problems that we're working through, but that is also a third one, Kurt.
If I can just make a point here, Kurt. Mr. Chairman, can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
It's on.
Just so that everybody knows, I am the Barnstable County representative to the MPO. And the MPO is the Metropolitan Planning Organization. It's sort of the state, federal, local group that oversees the programming of the funding for this. And so this comes up at all our meetings, and we continue to keep the pressure on all the players to sort of move this along. And I agree with everything that Jeff has said, is this project has morphed because of the other components of it, and because the cost related to the other components has gone up, it's sort of fallen off the track, so to speak. And so it's great to see a plan B in place where we can kind of continue the progress of the wastewater improvements, along Route 28 while we coordinate with Mass DOT. But I can just assure everybody that at our MPO meetings, this is a regular topic of conversation about how we can get this back on track.
Yeah, because, I mean, in the, I don't know the exact date, it was before I was a selectman, which was 2010, we had, in this room, rolls of plans this big with everything about Route 28 we wanted to do, and nobody seems to remember that we even did that exercise, but, it's unfortunate that it goes back that far, and we're still here at this date talking about it.
Yeah, well, if I just to close this, it was originally a road resurfacing project, and now there are other dimensions to the project.
Before that, it wasn't a road resurface, it was a major rehab.
I understand, but for the Mass DOT, it was a road resurfacing project principally, and now there are other aspects to
Which is
it.
good, because it all needs attention, right? We can't ignore all those other problems just for the sake of repaving the road.
It does, so it may create other opportunities. So I think to some degree, if there's a way for us to keep on with our progress and then figure out a way to work with Mass DOT to sort of take advantage of some of the other opportunities. This is a different place that Mass DOT has been in. In the past, typically, if you had just a road resurfacing project, that's all you got. All right, now we're in a position now where the state is actually looking at finding ways to make some of these roads safer, more pedestrian-friendly, more user-friendly, more bike-friendly. And that's, after years of pressure, now they're there. And so because of those considerations now being part of the design process, we now have these other issues that we have to contend with. So our challenge is finding a way to move forward, and the work is being done, done to do that, while we get some of these other aspects of the roadway improvements funded and then back on a schedule. So that work's ongoing. I just want people to know that at the MPO meetings, we talk about this, and obviously with the new administration, there'll be an added emphasis on this as well.
Okay. Next.
Thank you. And then, as Jeff alluded to, a little more optimism on the second project, the MassDOT project, the intersection of 28 North Main Street, Old Main Street. As of our meeting, they indicated that they're on schedule to bid that by the fall or late 2023, end of this year. So that would line up with getting potentially a construction contract executed by the end of June of 2024. So obviously continue to coordinate with them and monitor that situation, but at least a little more optimistic about the timing of that project working out to the town's advantage. And then for contracts 2 and 3, which is the piece between those two projects, we're in the process of getting our permit application together. We did discuss that with MassDOT, and they indicated that they would put a high priority on getting that application through the process. Had some discussion with town staff just to close up a point that had come up before, basically indicating that all the properties that abut Route 28 and Old Main Street will be included in Phase 1. There were a few that, at least from the way the parcels lay out and where people's septic systems were, it would have made more sense to serve, or will make more sense to serve them from some of the side streets outside the MassDOT project. But we're going to work that into a town contract to get all those properties tied in under Phase 1. So just a minor point there for clarification. And then in terms of permitting, and we'll get more into detail of permitting, we're in the process of preparing a request for determination of applicability to submit to Conservation Commission for contracts 2 and 3. So we've been coordinating with the conservation agent on getting that submittal into the town. And that should happen this month. So next slide, obviously, I think what most people are here for and interested in and want to discuss, and certainly ready to do that. As you know, we prepared our opinion of probable construction costs for the project. Just for clarification, as we've talked about, for the treatment plant, that OPCC is based on the 30% design submittal that we just talked about a little bit, and for the collection system, the 60% design submittal. So obviously, they're at different stages, different construction contingencies being carried for each of the two, but that's the latest design submittals that we have that we based the estimate on. So the overall OPCC, as you can see, it was at 212, just shy of 212 million, which obviously is not where we know not where the town wants to be. In some sense, it does sort of validate the estimate that we had submitted to DEP with the PEF in August. But our focus now is on, as Matt alluded to a little bit earlier, as Lou did as well, cost savings measures and advancing some ideas that could potentially bring that number down moving forward. So we'll get into that a little bit. As Matt said, there's a value engineering process that's happening as well, working in concert with the OPM and looking at other alternatives to save some design construction costs. So next slide is just a summary of where we are and where we were. So the first line shows the breakdown between the treatment plant and the collection system as it was submitted to DEP with the SRF in August, where we were at the $207 million mark, and the latest estimate, as I indicated, the 212. In general terms, you can see the cost of the resource recovery facility went up around 10 million, and the collection system came down about 5 million, so that accounts for the difference of about $5 million over the PEF estimate. So as I said, the focus quickly turned once we got that number to, okay, how can we save some money? So that the design team for the treatment plant came up with a list of potential cost savings items that are shown in this slide, discussed them with the town and the OPM at a workshop, as Matt indicated, and the team is in the process of reviewing these items and determining which ones make the most sense to incorporate into the design to help reduce the cost. I don't know if we need or want to go through any more detail in some of these items, or...
Well, the only thing I will say about these items is I think we have a pretty good understanding with the design team, the owner's project manager, and town staff that this is a pretty good list, and that most of these are ones that we can accept and will help with the overall cost. There were a few that didn't make sense, and one that we're still working through is the process gallery. It's the area where the pipes are adjacent to the sequencing batch reactors, and whether that needs to be its own open space or whether that can actually be in vaults, the necessary equipment be in vaults. And the challenge with that is if it's in a vault type of arrangement, those are confined spaces and there's additional criteria to access those, and that's a concern from an operations standpoint. So we're still working through that item, and I do believe the owner's project manager was kind of looking at the one related to the number of SBRs and to see if that made sense. So there's still some standing items with regard to these cost savings ideas, but the bottom line is there's a fair number of them that make sense, and we're still working through. I'm sure if we wanted to, we could dig into the details on these if you'd like, but.
In the interest of time, could you just address the two big ticket items, 10 and 13?
I'll let Matt or Bill, if you want to.
Sure, I can jump in. So those are the biggest numbers, obviously attract the most attention. So figured we might end up here. PCS 10, delay procurement of D-night filter equipment if permit terms allow. So earlier when we did the perspectives and went over the overview of the plant, after the sequencing batch reactors and the equalization tank, there are things called denitrification filters. The simple explanation is through a filtration process that's biologically active, you are able to further drive down nitrogen. At this stage, based on what we might anticipate for permit requirements, that would be necessary to guarantee the town's ability to meet those treatment limits. It's possible that depending on the terms of the permit, those might not be necessary. We might be able to get the nitrogen removal needed via just the sequencing batch reactors. So that one's kind of, I guess I'd say, out there, but not necessarily an immediate option. It is going to depend on the permit terms themselves. So that's PCS 10. And for what it's worth, PCS 11 is also tied to that. One is just procurement of the equipment. And one of the things that we kind of separated out for evaluation purposes would be building the tankage now, for the sake of efficiency, and delaying the equipment. So depending on the permit terms, you might be able to initially meet your nitrogen limits without the D-night process, but could build the infrastructure and then add the specific equipment itself later down the line. So 10 and 11, again, are tied to one another. 13, postpone construction of the fourth SBR, or sequencing batch reactor. Obviously a big ticket item. It's essentially just taking out 1/4 of the tankage that we showed earlier, at least the SBR tankage itself. And this wouldn't necessarily affect effluent numbers like we just talked about, but what it would do is reduce the overall capacity. So essentially based on, we went with 4 tanks based on flow projections through phases 1 through 3 of the collection system. And the 4th one would be necessary to meet those projections. There is a ramping up period when this plant first comes online. I think we're familiar with the fact that we won't be at those top end projections for several years. So the thought process was, if it's incredibly tight in terms of money, the 4th SBR, or of one of the 4 SBRs, could be eliminated from the design, and would represent obviously a $6 to $8 million savings. I don't know that that's necessarily advisable, just based on the fact that you're going to need it eventually, and you're going to pay the least amount now. But certainly wanted, when we were developing this list, we certainly wanted to make all the options at least available or out there for discussion. So those are obviously draw the most attention, 2 pretty big ticket items. I don't know that realistically we're settled on anything, and it sounds like the OPM's still looking into 13 in a little more detail.
In either case, it just pushes them out of phase 1.
Correct.
Eventually got to do them.
Yes.
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah, and that, to me, it doesn't save money, it just postpones it. So we got that consideration too, especially with the inflation being what it is, number one. Number two, if there's a realistic expectation that we can accelerate the other phases, you're gonna need it sooner rather than later. And I think we talked about the D-night, we kind of need those for the balance of the nitrogen in that area anyways, right, Dave?
Yeah, well, one of the ways I look at the D-night filters is it gives us flexibility moving forward. We are going to have less of a need to have DEP dictate the plan to us if we have the ability to remove even more nitrogen than just the SBRs allow. But
yeah, I was just going to add that, this is a nitrogen removal project mainly. And so you could probably meet your permit because it's probably going to be a mass loading permit versus don't exceed 3 parts type of thing. So to give up that additional 2 milligram per liter by removing the D-night filters means you're removing less nitrogen. In the long term, as you indicated, Kurt, yes, you'll need to do that in order to meet the nitrogen balance in the Parkers River watershed.
Going back to another item, you mentioned SRF and contract execution by June of next year. Are we executing contracts this year, I hope? Okay,
Yes.
so we're still where we talked about before.
Correct. So, and we'll get into that a little bit as well. Correct. Contracts 2 and 3, we're bidding those prior to town meeting. You can't execute them until after town meeting when you have the funding
Have the funding.
appropriated. Correct.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions? Go ahead, Bruce.
You know, just looking at number one, odor control, obviously,
I know that's your big thing.
I'd like to keep that in there, you know. Going to need that at some point in time, so that's important. Number 7, vehicle storage. Can any vehicle storage be of the building where you are now, the DPW Water Department building, in that area?
Well, the idea behind the vehicle storage design currently is to add onto that, so the additional, 4 or 5 vehicles that are needed for wastewater can be included in that building. So currently, there's not enough capacity in the existing building to add those
Okay, that was
additional
my
vehicles
question.
under that current cover.
With the new DPW building, I know some
Like a
moved down.
canopy is the
Okay.
idea with this, yeah.
Okay. And then number 9, imported sand. Is that gravel we're getting from somewhere else, or is that gravel that type of sand for the filters?
Yeah, the DEP design guidelines currently state, which the design guidelines are intended for systems 100,000 gallons and less. There are no design guidelines per se for above, but they require you to bring in 2 foot of, it's like the sand for Title V system.
Yeah.
We have not done that in other facilities, so we believe we can get the waiver here as well, particularly where the infiltration rate is based on existing soils, not new soil you're bringing in.
Right.
So,
Anything else, Bruce?
Oh, good.
All right, guess we can move on.
Great, thank you. And then, so in terms of the collection system, unlike the treatment plant where there are a lot of different components and buildings and processes, the collection system is mainly 2 components. It's the pipe to convey the flow, and then in this case, for these contracts, there are 2 pumping stations to convey the flow to the treatment plant. So we don't have the same breadth of opportunity to save a lot of money. The pipe is the pipe. One way to reduce cost, obviously, would be put less pipe in, and then you're serving less property. So that's certainly a consideration if it needs to go that way, but we focus mainly on pumping station 4. So pumping station 4, as a reminder, is the one located on Long Pond Drive between Long Pond and Route 28, between Pancake Man Restaurant and CVS. So that will take flow, everything upstream of that, up 28 and Old Main Street, under Phase 1. And then under future phases, it'll take quite a bit of flow from phases 6, 7, and 8 in particular, and some from Phase 4. So we've talked about this station before, and Kurt, you brought up a few meetings ago, sort of the complication of, designing what we need now and building what we need now to accommodate not only the initial flows for Phase 1, but being able to expand it for future capacity to handle the future phases as they connect. So I'll get into a little bit on the alternatives that we looked at. That pumping station 4, in terms of the OPCC, came in at around $9.5 million. It was a big ticket item in the context of the overall project. So that was clearly an area where we needed to focus to see if we could come up with other options to reduce that cost. Again, pipe, there's not much we can do with except cutting out some streets here and there. Pumping station 5 was a significantly less expensive pumping station. It's pretty straightforward, much smaller. That's the one located down on South Shore Drive, serving that area. So not a lot of opportunities to save a lot of cost in that for that pumping station. And then minor item, not a big ticket item, but certainly worthy of discussion, and talk to town staff about it. The force mains from each of those pumping stations were originally designed with ductile iron pipe. We talked about the benefits of changing to high-density polyethylene, HDPE. A, it's cheaper, and B, has higher corrosion resistance. So we're going to make that change as we move to the 90% design. And then we did talk about having add alternates, particularly for contract 2, and that would be a case where we'd have a base bid for most of the pipe, most of the trunk line pipe, and then some of the side streets, particularly between Old Main Street and Route 28, would be add alternates. So depending on how the bid prices come in, the town would have the ability to either accept or not accept sort of groups of streets. We broke them into 3 groups of streets in that area between 28 and Old Main Street. So those would be, you know, they're not critical for future flow to convey it. They're just to serve those individual streets between those 2 main roads. So we'll put those on as add alternates, see how the bid prices come in, and the town may decide to accept or not accept depending on how those come in.
Would those be stubbed to the right-of-way anyways? So you already have the edge, say the edge of the roadway, and then they'd be available to connect to run up that particular side street, right?
Correct. If the town decided to forego some or all of those side streets, then we would put stubs in off of 28 and/or Old Main Street so that you wouldn't have to dig that road up again in the future. Then you could extend them, correct? Yes. That would be the approach.
Was there a cost savings between the West Main material?
We haven't priced that out. It's not significant, but it is cheaper. It is cheaper. We'll come up with a number for that.
It's actually cheaper for installation costs, because it's so much wider. You can do a lot more linear footage in a given day for installation.
You seeing more of that now? Is that town's going
There's certainly more consideration for using it, yes.
Do they come in longer lengths, too, or not?
Yeah, because it's what they call butt fused
Right.
together.
Kind of like the gas company does their
So
work.
they
You
can
ever
dig a
seen
longer
that?
trench and roll it in versus, you know, you gotta lift all the ductile iron in with backhoes or cranes or whatever. So much easier installation, length and weight.
But if it saves money, to me, it makes a lot more sense from just a material standpoint, that, like you said, it's gonna stand up to corrosion better, it'll certainly stand up to chemicals better, mostly.
Correct. There's better hydraulic characteristics too, those
Smoother,
smoother wall
yeah.
pipe. So from that regard, it's helpful as well.
Okay.
So, as I said, you know, the main focus was on PS4. So this is a snapshot of the site plan. Again, Route 28's on the left side of the sheet, Long Pond Drive on the right, Pancake Man Restaurants to the top of the page, and CVS to the bottom. So this is actually an old, it's a water department site. There used to be an elevated storage tank here that obviously is not there anymore. So, you know, we targeted this for that particular reason, because it's town-owned parcel, you don't have easements to take and whatnot. So this is, we're calling it Design Alternative 1. This is what the OPCC was based on. In this concept, as you can see, the large red rectangle that's hatched is the footprint of the pumping station itself. And in this case, what the concept was is to utilize the design that we did back in 2010 for the drive-in site, with the PS3 we call it at the time. Same concept there, whereby it's what we call a wet pit, dry pit pumping station. So essentially half of the building, in this case the back half off of away from Long Pond Drive, would be the wet well. So that would be where the wastewater would enter the building below grade and flow into the wet well. And on the front side of the building is what we call the dry pit. So you would have an area to work. You have the pump, that's where the pumps are located. Suction lines come through the walls for the wet well. So it's in this case, it was roughly a 30 by 40 foot dimension in terms of the size of the footprint. Above grade, you'd have a above grade structure with operations level and equipment for the electrical equipment, monorails to hoist the pumps up. So this was a concept that was forwarded back in 2010 for Pumping Station 3, so we carried that over here. The issue here and where a lot of the cost is, obviously two main things, is the size of it, the footprint, but the fact that it's all cast-in-place concrete. And this is a deep excavation. It's about 30 feet deep by the time you get down to the bottom of the wet well, and it's all cast-in-place concrete. So between the forming and the reinforcing and the concrete itself, that, as you can imagine, gets quite expensive. So in this configuration, your flow would come in from both Route 28 and Long Pond Drive and come into the back of the pumping station. And then we're showing the force main coming out that would eventually go out Long Pond Drive, up Forest Road, Winslow Gray, and Buck Island to the treatment plant. So that was the concept here. We've got a pad in the back, hatched in red for the generator. That would be a standalone outside, and then a future pad for odor control equipment. And as I touched on before, one of the advantages of this arrangement is, as I said, you've got the dry pit area so that you have pumps. Initially, we'd have 2 relatively small pumps in that pump room down in the lower level, but we have room to expand to 3 pumps and much larger pumps in the future when those future phases come in. So that's the flexibility that you have here, and the ease of replacing those pumps in the future once you need to increase the capacity of the station. So we took a step back and said, okay, what's another way or other ways that we can achieve the same goal here and significantly decrease the cost. So this design alternative 2 is what we think makes the most sense to do, and we've discussed with town staff, and they agree as well. So what you're seeing here, again, the same influent sewers coming from Long Pond Drive and Route 28. They would come into what we're calling a flow combining manhole, sort of that circle in the middle of the site. And then it would turn toward the bottom of the sheet and enter a wet well. So you'll see those 2 rectangular boxes in the middle of the sheet. Those are the wet well and the valve vault. So in this case, the wet well is much smaller than it would need to be for the larger pumping station. The advantage here is that we can use precast concrete box sections. So that takes out all that cost of the cast-in-place concrete for the first alternative, and that's where the majority of the cost savings come. So that wet well is roughly 10 by 12, and again, 30 feet deep. And in this case, it's a submersible pumping station. So the pumps actually sit in the wastewater within the wet well. Again, this is sized so that it can handle the smaller initial flows from phase 1, but it has the ability to add another pump and increase the size of the initial pumps in order to handle future flow from the phases as the program gets built out. So this does have the ability to be expanded to handle the ultimate flow that would be conveyed to this location. The valve vault is, just as you would imagine, is a series of pipes and valves associated with the force main, and then the third rectangular structures that you see there is a meter vault, so that we can meter flow coming out of this pumping station. And then again, it goes out the force main along the same route to the treatment plant. And in this case, so toward the left of the sheet, the 2 red hatched rectangles, the one closest to Long Pond Drive would be the control building. So rather than having a much larger above-grade building, in this case it would be relatively small, typically around 14 by 20, 14 by 22 roughly dimensions on that control building, and then a generator behind it outside. So that control building would house all of the electrical equipment necessary to run the pumping station. And again, the concept here is the wet well is big enough, the physical infrastructure you're putting in is large enough to handle the future flows. It's just the pumps that need to be changed out in the future to handle the increased flow as additional phases come on board. So we did a conceptual level cost on this arrangement, and this came in on the order of $4.5 million. So you're looking at a potential $5 million cost savings over the original concept for this station. Functionally, it still delivers what you need in terms of conveying flow to the treatment plant, and serves the same purpose as the original intent.
And what I would say, that's approximately the number we're looking for to bring that back in line, the total cost for the program for phase 1 back in line with the PEF submission. it's the first time I've heard the cost, but it's interesting that it did line up with that.
Got it about 2 hours ago. So,
Repeat the number again?
about 4.5 million as compared to 9.5 for the design alternative one. So about a $5 million savings. Again, these are rough numbers, so add a $500,000 plus or minus on each.
So the other thing I wanted to say was wanted to run this past the committee because what was being anticipated here, and you saw in that first alternative, was a larger building that, as I think we've talked about, Kathy Williams is spending a lot of time coming up with some design improvements for the drive-in site building with regards to, you know, what that looks like and its appearance from Route 28. This would be a very different approach, which is much similar to the other pump stations, 1, 2, and 5, where it's more like a shed-style building. So we didn't want there to be any surprises with what is being proposed in this particular case to save some money, but, you know, does work for future phases.
So 2 questions.
Yes, sir.
On the second alternative, if in the future there was a need for more pit, could you add a 3rd and a 4th precast pit to this site? Add on to get back towards the capacity you have in the first iteration?
You could, but you would need to. So this wet well would be sized so that it can handle the flow. So again, these are submersible pumps that this wet well would be sized to accommodate 3 pumps, just like the other one would have 3 pumps in the future. But initially, we'd only put 2 pumps in and be 2 smaller pumps. So that once the future phases come in, you'd replace those 2 pumps and add a 3rd pump, all within the confines of this same wet well. So it's
Not being an engineer and not professing any expertise, I asked the question, is there some safety factor in the first iteration, i.e., let's say pump failure and you were using the basin for a storage facility in the context of preventing, if you will, a backup to the users?
Yeah, I think it's more just like an ease of replacement because you're working in the dry essentially, where with a submersible pump, you know, these are obviously.
Talking about a disaster, total pump failure, no generators.
Correct. So we would say no generators and no power to this. Well, that's going to impact both, facilities.
World, I know.
Right. The
Well,
doomsday scenario.
Yeah, no, we've actually replaced some of these pumping stations before, and because the pumps had to be replaced, what they've done is they've actually brought in bypass pumping, and with bypass generators. So you could take out that generator, you could take out those submersible pumps and bring in a portable generator and portable pumps that suck out of the wet well and then connect into the force main and bypass that.
I'm just thinking in terms of
No, it's
letting
a good
gravity
question,
do
yeah.
its thing and, storm until such time as you can move it.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that's the problem. You're not going to stop the wastewater coming once that happens. But
Once you get a system, you got a system forever.
correct.
So-
But in terms of typical pump maintenance and replacement, there would be a davit crane that you'd lift the submersible pumps out of the wet well. The town will be provided with spare pumps to put in while the one you remove is being worked on. And as Dave said, if any bypassing needs to happen, in this valve vault, we have the piping arranged such that you can do exactly as Dave described, connect a temporary pump to the force main so that you can utilize the force main still with some temporary pumps while you're doing whatever repairs you need to do.
Are those pumps on rails so they can just pulled out?
They are, yes. Yep. It's still heavy, though. Still need a crane, but yes, they're
30
on.
foot's a long drop.
That's right. Yeah. Yep.
3.
Yes.
Kurt,
So
can I
just
can
had a
say
question.
a few words? Mark Galkowski.
Okay, go ahead, Mark.
How is everybody? Happy New Year. Regarding this site, I'm sure the gentlemen know, they've done their homework, that it's also it was a former site of a water tank, but it's still, the fault is still in place as far as water distribution goes.
Yeah.
The other part of that is this is the site, and Jeff and I talked about this a little bit before I left. But this is the site where the large diameter main comes off German Hill and terminates. So we have to take that all into consideration. especially keeping in mind that pipe's been in the ground over 50 years. Cast iron, poured lead joint, et cetera. So that construction will have to take that certainly into consideration, not only in the street, but also in this site. Make sure there's plenty of room to keep all that protected or replaced or whatever ends up happening.
Thank you. Yes, and we were obviously aware of the vault, and I've been working with Jeff and Laurie to investigate that, and that'll all be removed and included in the contractor's work to prep the site for the pumping station.
So whatever's there will probably be abandoned.
Yes.
Lee, did you want to say something?
Yes, thank you. I just, from an operational point of view, obviously the larger pump station, the traditional wet well, dry pit, has some additional advantages. And I just wanted to ask if there are any serious disadvantages to going in with this new concept, alternative 2.
As you indicated, Lee, you're right. As we talked about a little bit, having the dry pit in that arrangement certainly is an easier to work on the pumps as they're in place, because you're, as the name implies, you're working in the dry, as opposed to having, anytime you have an issue with the pump, you have to pull it up and typically, bring it back to the shop to work on it. So certainly an advantage there. In our mind, I don't think that necessarily outweighs the benefits and the value of decreasing the cost while maintaining the operational intent of the pumping station.
How often would you be replacing a submersible pump versus the other types?
Yeah, our experience, I don't think we've seen any difference necessarily. As you can imagine, as with any type of mechanical equipment, sometimes, something doesn't last as long as it should have, and other times it lasts a lot longer. It's just the nature of the beast. But in our experience, we haven't seen any shorter lifespans for submersible pumps as compared to dry pit pumps.
Okay, last question.
Yes.
The inlet works to the wet wells. Do you have any design consideration for putting in some kind of muffin monster or reduction in size of the type of flow and the type of sewage that goes in there?
A great question, Lee, and I fail to point out, if you look at the site plan, between what we label the flow combining manhole that captures the sewers from Long Pond and Route 28, the next manhole down toward the wet well, there's a grinder that's going to be in that manhole. So it's a good question, and yes, we would have a grinder installed in that manhole.
And those inlet chambers, the combined, they could be used as for bypassing as well, or would you not?
So if the station needed to go offline, yeah, presumably that would be our thoughts, that you would plug the downstream sewer coming out of that flow combining manhole and pump out of that manhole itself. So you put the temporary pumps right in there, and that would essentially act as your temporary wet well while you're working on anything downstream that would require you to bypass the flow.
So you could actually put a gate valve or some kind of a valve in there as an emergency measure for that purpose, right?
You could. We wouldn't necessarily recommend that. It's a big valve
Okay.
that's probably only going to get used once every 30 or 40 years. So
Right.
you can put a temporary plug on the downstream sewer and plug that outlet line, and so that, again, the combining manhole would function as a wet well.
Okay.
Very easy to deploy, and I wouldn't advise putting a gate valve on that line, because it wouldn't get used enough to. When you do need it, it probably wouldn't give you a good close, good shutdown.
I agree.
especially in a wastewater environment, it's tough to keep those working. Great. Thank you, Lee. Good questions.
Yep.
And then, so just as a sort of a third alternative that we looked at, what you're looking at here, design alternative 3, same general concept as the one we just looked at. However, the difference here is a much smaller wet well. So the intent of this arrangement would be just to serve phase 1 through 3 flows. This is essentially the same pumping station that we're installing or designing and hopefully we'll be installing at Pumping Station 5 along South Shore Drive. So this is a much smaller wet well, again, only sized sufficiently to handle flows from phase 1 through 3. An associated control building, again, identical to Pumping Station 5. So the OPCC that we got for Pumping Station 5 was around $1.5 million to $2 million. So there would be some savings here, but it would, similar to some of the items that we talked about for the treatment plant, it would only be deferring the cost to later because you would need to update this pumping station in order to handle flows beyond phase 4. So if you look at the next slide, you can see we brought in what you would need to do at some point in the future, whether that's phase 4 or beyond, depending on how flows come. You would essentially need to build the same station that we talked about as design alternative 2. So not only would you be building the initial, shown in red, smaller submersible pumping station, you would eventually need to build a bigger one that's shown in green in this figure, that's essentially the same as the one that we talked about with design alternative 5. So it's just deferring costs till later. Yes, it would save money for phase 1, but it would not give you the capacity to handle all the flow that will eventually get here. In our mind, we see more value and advantage in design alternative 2, gives you more flexibility, and doesn't sort of put off that future cost of building what's essentially a second pumping station. Under this arrangement, it would all work. You could still keep the initial pumping station in service and use it during times of low flow, like in the winter time, and give you a chance to do some maintenance on the larger pumping station. But, again, this configuration works. You'd end up with 2 control buildings, more structures on the site, and obviously more costs down the road when that needs to be implemented. So for those reasons, our recommendation is design alternative 2 that gives you the infrastructure to handle all the future flows. It is fairly significant cost savings from the original concept, and doesn't handcuff you. Under this alternative 3, if you were to put the smaller station in and then you decided to reconfigure your phasing so that in phase 2, maybe you're going to serve more of Bass River and more flow would come to this station earlier, then you're building that second station earlier than we anticipate as we sit here today. So for those reasons, I think alternative 2 makes more sense. Gives you more flexibility operationally while still giving you cost savings over the original concept.
And
Mike,
did 3 have a cost to it or not? Or did you not go that far?
So essentially, this would be the sum of the 2. So, if we said $1.5 million for the first original station that's similar to PS5, and then another $4.5 million for that design alternative 2. So it's essentially, it's additive. So it would be the.
So you start at 1.5 and go to 4.5 and then 9.5?
Build the 4.5 later to get the second pumping station in. Yeah.
And the other thing too, and I know you see it probably more in building codes and other regulations that we deal with here, but, there are times when you had assumptions you were gonna do something in the future, and then the code changed, and all of a sudden you can't do what you thought you were gonna do, so. To me, I know you wanna save money, but the more you do up front, the better off you are in the future too. So that's how I look at these things. Okay. Anybody else have any questions on this?
Mr. Chairman, I had a question, but I won't interrupt a committee member first.
No, that's all right, Mr. Horgan, continue.
Mike, in your memoranda, you mentioned that there's some concerns with velocities in the force main during those low flow periods, and that one recommendation might be to upsize the pumps or to, have a daily operational where you turn both pumps on. Has there been any consideration into installing a parallel force main initially? I know your memoranda talks about, the cost of a future force main, but, almost doing a redundant, smaller face force main in the initial construction. You'd have all the trenching would be open. So it'd be essentially the cost of the pipe. It might service the town during those low flow periods as well, but would also provide some redundancy in the event anything ever happened to the force main, that you'd have a backup. So I didn't know if you gave that any consideration during the development of those alternatives and what you think that cost would be of the additional material of, say, just an 8-inch line, in the same trench.
Yeah, thanks, Lou. That's a good question. And we did look at dual force mains, not necessarily in the context that you described where you would install both initially. We looked at the concept of putting a smaller 8-inch force main in for phase 1 flows, because ideally that would be the size of the force main to accommodate just phase 1 flows. The problem there would be, again, if we didn't put it in initially, as you said, that we didn't look at that as an alternative. We certainly can evaluate that. When you built that second component of the pumping station or upgraded the pumps, depending on which concept you went with, you'd have to put in a second force main at that point in the future. So we did look at that in that context. And that's where we came to, well, let's just put in a bigger force main initially. In this case, it's a 14-inch force main that, yes, it's oversized for the flows that we're going to see during phase 1, but as you indicated and we called out in the memo, you could overcome that by, as you said, putting on both pumps, at least once a day in order to flush the line to move any solids through that, so we don't have deposition of solids. So we looked at it in the context of an initial build and a future build, as opposed to putting them both in initially. We can take a look at that. Yes, you've saved your trenching costs, but I don't have the footage in front of me. It's a fairly long force main, so that to go all that way with the second one, it's something we can take a look at, certainly.
Like 1.5 miles. Does that sound right?
Sounds about
Probably
right.
that neighborhood,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think it's around 8,800 feet, I think. So it sounds about 1.5 miles. Something we can certainly look at, Lou, thank you.
Okay, anybody else have any questions on this?
I did have just a question with regard to the location of other planned pump stations, and why this one figures so prominently in the later phases, and why we're concerned about phases 6, 7, and 8, if I understand correctly, coming back to this location when those locations are much further away. And there are, if I'm reading the map right, the squares are very small and my eyesight is very bad, and I am old. Where are the other pump stations, and are there any unknowns out there where you would say, as we go along and lay the pipe and we look at how the town develops over the next 20 or 30 years, that we might need a new location for a pump station that might not be on our vision right now, but it could be somewhere else that would obviate the need to make this a pump station that could serve all 8 phases? If I'm understanding, that's how this is being designed, to serve all 8 phases. So I guess I'll parcel my question. Where are the other pump stations, and are they somehow inadequate to cover the other phases which are further out? Or is this just classic design of how this is the best way to lay out the plan for pump stations? Because quite frankly, when you talk about an alternative 3 that's $1.5 million, and it covers us for the first 3 phases, that to me is somewhat attractive.
Understood. Yeah, good question. And there are many other pumping stations in the future phases. The concept that we have laid out is that the flow from those those are more intermediate pumping stations to, as the topography fluctuates throughout the areas, obviously you need to pump to convey the flow. So the concept here is to convey that flow from those phases, as I indicated, to this site. That's not to say that, 15, 20 years from now, things could change, as you said, and there might be another solution that would be potentially possible to convey flow from another phase directly to the plant. In our estimation, the system as we've laid out is the most economical in our estimation at this point. But this station does give you that flexibility. If things change, you still need this station regardless to serve at least some of the area. If there's another way to intercept flow somewhere further up in the system to pump directly to the treatment plant, then that's something that, as the future phases get designed, could be evaluated. But, we needed to lay out a concept that worked for the town, that does handle all the phases, and this is the concept that was developed. It's not to say that there aren't other solutions, but they would require more and larger pumping stations to accommodate the same goal.
My question goes to your knowledge and experience of this. You laid this out as an alternative, so there must be some worth to it, and some value to us considering it. And given the length of time this contract, this project, its project life, I would hate to be in a position to overbuild for something we really don't know what's going to happen in the future. That we're building in a capacity here that could serve, that there would be some overcapacity, and that it couldn't be a later decision, a smarter decision maybe, on location. That's all. That's just a comment. It's really not a question. But, I mean, obviously, you've laid it out as an alternative for us to consider, and there are some attractive pieces to it, certainly.
Yeah, no, you're raising a very good point, but I think it's actually an argument for the recommended plan alternative too, because, if you do direct flows farther up in the Bass River watershed directly to the treatment plant, then you haven't made the big investment in the wet well, dry well type structure, which is much more costly. That would have been the standard structure 20, 25 years ago. That was what people did because they knew they needed to last 50 to 100 years. We're trying to bring the costs down, provide the same level of certainty in the design to the town. But if flows are diverted and you don't receive that here, all you got to do is just resize your pumps. You have no other investment to make because you've already done a wet well, which can be bigger or smaller, and you can adjust the pump sizing to do that in the future to accommodate that. So it's actually more cost-effective doing it in alternative two to address that issue. And there is, I believe, in the comprehensive wastewater management plan, or the notice of project change, a overall plan that shows conceptually where the other pumping stations would be located. But the town wants to even consider different types of sewers. We were showing vacuum, pressure, and gravity. There's a hesitancy to move with vacuum, so there may be more pumping stations if there's more gravity sewers.
Thank you.
Are we looking for a vote on this from the committee, or which alternatives to go with?
We need one?
Not necessarily. I mean, the recommendation is 2, and if we don't hear you disagreeing with that, we'll go with 2. That's certainly what's being recommended.
Personally, I like number 1, but I get this, saving $5 million, nothing wrong with that. And that's only from a guy who's done service work for most of my time. So I get to be the guy that tries to work on that after you guys put it in.
Understood.
So, working out of a dry well versus a wet well is a lot nicer. But I get, you can save a lot of money, and you still get some good service. The other question I had quickly, because we've got 3.5 minutes left now. Are these pumping stations going to use the same pumps so that you could, so if you have the shelf of however many pumps, you can just take one and put it in any station? Or do you think most stations are going to be sized similarly, or are they all going to have different sized pumps?
They're typically all going to be different.
Okay.
Yeah, there's so many different characteristics based on the flow.
Head pressures, all that, right? Yeah, pump head.
I know.
Okay.
We're talking on the collection system. I just wanted to mention that I get a question, and Jay, probably daily, about what phase I'm in, where I'm going to collection, and I know we have the charts that I bring to each of the meetings anyway, but it does show the pumping stations too. But I just think they need to be updated. I mean, people are coming in, both these charts, this one's 22, I think that one is 19, showing the different phases and what's going on, so I just think it's important that we probably get this, and I don't know where I want to discuss this here or at public meetings, comment section here, but people want to come in here and just see what phase they're in, which probably that colored one would be better to hold up. But I think it's important now that if you're going to extend it a little bit to Old Main Street to pick up some more, that we might want to just show that phase. But one of the interesting points is when they come in, what phases I am. And
The honest answer is,
Pardon?
the only certainty is phase one.
Right,
Everything else is flexible, unfortunately.
right, and I
You
guess
don't know
that's
where
that's
the
the point in
DEP
time.
exercise is going to end up, or
Well, yeah.
demand from people. They may, again, I've said this for years, if people are willing to pay for it, we can put anybody in any order they want, just about.
Right. We might want to do more around Long Pond if we're having trouble with cyanobacteria, and do we look at that first? Or, they just want to know what phase it is, and if there's approximate time frame that goes with it. That's what I usually hear is, what's the time frame? I'm in phase 2 or 3. Approximate times that we can discuss.
We're going with draft phases at these
Yeah.
meetings, and people generally accept the concept.
Yeah.
The real answer probably lies in a revenue-based solution, which is you can't go to a phase to deal with a pond issue without the commensurate revenue to drive it there.
Yep.
So if you're not making any money going along pond, you gotta go where you're gonna generate the revenue to turn on the plant and keep it
Right,
running.
so they understand we're doing phase 1 first, and, obviously,
Well, that doesn't speak
Big
to
area.
that doesn't speak to the best revenue generation, to be honest. But along the way, those decisions are gonna be made continuously. Can't tell you what that phasing is gonna look like until we cost out and then revenue out the next phase and the next phase, the next phase.
right. And some of the people come in, which is interesting, the discussion is, I always say, point where you're located, so we get an idea what phase they're in, and some of it's easier. It's the interesting ones that point right to the white part that we're not sewering.
Yeah.
Try to explain why we're not sewering right that area next to the watersheds. And of course, I just say, because we've got, going straight out, we got the dilution, even though we're gonna phase underneath it, so.
The reaction.
I know we're gonna stud for it and plan for it, and the pipes are sized for it.
That speaks
but-
exactly to the point. That was a revenue-based decision to include Shore Road.
So,
Yeah, the plan you're looking at, Bruce, was laid out for each phase one every 5 years.
Yeah.
So that's how it's the 8 phases over 40 years. But if the new Title V and watershed regulations do go forward and become implemented, the town will need to relook at the phasing in the Bass River watershed. You're very close with some tweaking in Lewis Bay and Parker's River to meeting the 75% nitrogen removal within 20 years. However, you're not even close in the Bass River watershed, because as you can see, those were the latter phases, 6, 7, and 8. So those are the ones that would have to be moved up and done more quickly if the current proposed regulations are implemented. So, as we've always said, you got to build phase 1, focus on that. The others are all going to change at some point.
just trying to keep it updated as much as we can, because I know we're probably not gonna put vacuum sewer lines that we had talked about, and that might
Flip
change
to
a
this
little
and
bit.
just say
so.
bullets pretty
Just
much.
something I thought is interesting, that
discussed and
what we
to
get
save
on a
time,
daily.
don't go through
I know I've sent some of the questions over to DPW now to further explain. I think you've picked up, Jeff, with some of the people who've come over, or even visited you.
Yes, absolutely.
That being said, we will get you updated plans, especially the 2019 one, obviously is outdated now, but we'll get you a few sets of updated plans. In the interest of time, Mr. Chair, I don't want to spend a lot of time going through these unless anyone has specific questions. I will just repeat what Lou had mentioned. Obviously, the big good news is town made the intended use plan, the draft intended use plan. So you're in line for SRF funding, principal forgiveness. We actually had a call with DEP today to walk through some of our questions on SRF and the supplemental grant. Town also is designated one of 4 projects to receive supplemental funding through the bipartisan infrastructure law funding. Still unclear how much that would be and how that would get rolled out, but you clearly are in line for that as well, which is great news. So essentially, it's going to be an increase in the principal forgiveness. The amount and how that actually gets implemented is still unclear at this point to us, but.
So how much do they have in bipartisan money?
That we don't.
A lot more than they're going to give you.
Can you clarify a point previously that they
Yes.
were setting an interest rate this month for that fund? It's in our notes from the last meeting.
Setting an interest rate.
The SRF fund?
So the town, because this is a nitrogen project, the town would qualify for 0% loan. The way it rolls out, the standard is 2%. But if you meet certain requirements in terms of nitrogen removal, the land use controls, the approved CW1P, then you qualify for 0% loans. And that's the intent.
And did I say 25% forgiveness somewhere? No?
You may have seen it somewhere, whether it's correct or not.
That's why I'm asking.
So
If I misheard it or was mistold,
So it
whatever.
looks like
Were your eyes open?
if you look at the first sub-bullet under the SRF, 6.6% for Tier 2. Yarmouth is a Tier 2 community. So it looks like that's 6.6%. I believe that was last year's. I believe that's going to stay for this year. So you can anticipate that, and again, anything from the BIL would be on top of that. And that 6%, I did clarify today, it's locked in. So if that number changes over the next 20 years, you're still at the 6.6% for the
That's
life.
the worst case.
For the life of the loan. It's not going to go down from there. It won't go up either if the contributions go up over the years, but.
We're just talking about phase 1, so in future phases, could those numbers could potentially
Correct.
change, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, all future phases will be based on the
Their own
project
merits.
evaluation form application you submit.
Got it, okay. Is that it for that, for now?
Yeah, I didn't want to take up any more of your time. I know time is.
Yeah, I want to get 2 quick things, well, hopefully quick things. The DEP nitrogen-sensitive regulation response, we had wanted to send a letter out, but the DEP extended the comment period, so I think everybody got a,
Hasn't gone out yet?
no, that's,
That's why it's dated January 11th.
That is scheduled for a discussion of the Board of Selectmen at their meeting tomorrow. We wanted to make sure, and I have additional copies if anyone didn't get a copy of the letter. I can give those to you, just let me know. And we, after meeting with the committee,
Do I have electronically? Yeah.
we met with the Board of Selectmen to review the letter. Obviously, you know, there's a tremendous amount of feedback on a regional level that really has been developing, and the Board of Selectmen had asked that we be a little more specific and pointed, and really in opposition to the pointing out the problems
Right.
with those regulations. So that's the lion's share of the changes, to just be much clearer exactly what
Great
we're
letter.
looking for.
Yes,
Oh,
excellent letter.
and a little less, I think we started out nice, and then we
Yes.
saw what other people's
Yeah.
responses were. We said, oh, okay, let's not do that.
We actually read the regulations. Then
And then, I don't know if anybody's seen it, but Eric Turkington apparently had a, where was that? Was that in the Falmouth paper?
The former state representative has been writing a regular column in the Falmouth Enterprise, which gets printed in all of the enterprises. And he's been actually doing a fair amount of research and investigative work, and obviously, he's been putting it in the newspaper in his column, and I think it's been very helpful. So,
Absolutely. I think calling out the EP for, I don't know, not being here to our benefit is, I'm glad somebody finally did it.
Yeah, for the folks that haven't followed, I think, let me just sort of explain the thrust of the representatives, the former representative's comments. He's basically made it very, very clear, at least in the information that he's pulled together, that this proposal was put together under a lot of pressure from the Conservation Law Foundation. This is more or less reflective of what they've wanted, and there have been other people sort of at the table. And I think in one of his op-eds, he made the argument that you're either at the table or you're on the menu, so to speak. And so he's characterized all the municipalities impacted by this as being on the menu. And I think what's happening is and I've been sharing with our select board as well as with our town management and staff that there are stories being written all over the Cape. And either they're DPW directors, there are boards of health, health agents, and there's fairly universal criticism, fairly serious criticism about both of the components, both the unworkability of the so-called improvements to septic systems and the time frame that's being laid out, and the just unworkability of it. And then with respect to the watershed permits, I think there's been fairly universal criticism about the excessiveness and the sort of shifting of the goalposts, so to speak. Here we've gone through this process. We've got a plan. The various regulatory agencies have approved our plan and our time frame. And then now, after all the approvals have been done, after an enormous amount of work has been done, after a fair amount of public vetting and discussion, all of a sudden they want to change the rules and then put us in a position where we have to accelerate implementing the program. My fear is that what DEP is doing is putting us back into the pickle that we were in 2011, where we presented to the town of Yarmouth, the voters, a plan that was incredibly onerous and which they just widely rejected. And I think if DEP tries to do that again, we may end up with the same result. We may have a plan that we like. We may be very, but if we go with the DEP approach, we may find out that the finances of it such are so onerous that the voters reject it. So, an enormous amount of work has gone into developing the plan that we have now, and I think it's smart to focus on the phase one, but should these regulations go through, they carry a great deal of risk. I think that's being recognized in communities all across the Cape. So I think for us to write a letter that is pretty candid and straightforward is incredibly important, and other towns are doing that as well. You're seeing similar letters being submitted by other communities, and I've been sharing those letters with the board and with Bob and with Jeff so that we can just kind of keep abreast of what other people are saying. So
It's not just limited to Cape Cod either.
that's true.
South Coast is all wound up about this also.
My understanding is that the comments that are coming in from the South Coast are even more pointed, more blunt, yes. So, but it's good that we get in there. I think this letter has gone through a series of iterations, and I think we're at a good point. But there's new information. There may be some new twists that we might want to add to it. So, but your comments, we're here. Obviously, your comments are very welcome.
Okay, so I'm going to assume from what I'm hearing, the committee's okay with the latest iteration of the letter, and we can send it out.
Yes.
Very good, thank you. Quickly, Rick, grab a mic so that people at home can hear you, please.
Hi, Rick Bishop, Executive Director for the Friends of Bass River. And tomorrow, which is January 10th, we formally begin the MEPA permitting process for the wetlands restoration part of our project, 57.2 acres of wetlands restoration. We're having a public presentation on site tomorrow at 11 and 2 follow-up Zoom meetings at 3 and 8 p.m. But this is fairly significant. This is a major first step towards our project. Just want to let you know where we are. Thank you.
Thank you. Just for the record, that was Rick Bishop of Friends of Bass River. They're working on the upper Bass River watershed water quality issues there. All right, I think I'll push off the minutes till next time. Does anybody want to accelerate the time of the next meeting, hopefully not conflict with the Board of Health? Do you all think we need to be sooner or same schedule?
Sooner in the calendar or earlier in the day?
Well, I don't care about the time of day so much myself, but I'm just thinking,
Yeah.
instead of waiting a month,
I've
so.
suggested every 2 weeks, just to keep us on track for town meeting.
You think you have enough to keep us informed for a 2-week schedule,
We
or
could-
3 weeks?
You could dedicate a whole 2 hours to just financing the project the next time without
Well, that's the other reason I'd like to get, yeah.
consultant updates.
Why don't we see if we can do something sooner rather than later? Where's, your people all on Zoom waiting to get in, is that what it is?
No,
They're standing out there? Oh, so,
I have one on Zoom.
we're still,
Mary's
Mary,
with us.
she can stay on Zoom, right?
Couple people, it's not a big meeting, but,
Okay, well, I was hoping to be done before we
yeah.
got in your way. All right, we'll figure out something for a sooner rather than later meeting and continue this.
Pass along an email, see if everybody signs off for a date.
And I think that is a good idea, that we could put on that agenda a financing update, and we've got a presentation, a report, slides, and information.
Yeah, because that's always it's one of everybody's questions, so to get it out there as many times as we can will be important.
Board of Health meets the January 23rd.
Okay,
We're looking at January.
If we did it 2 weeks from today, it'd be the 24th. No, it would be also the 23rd.
yeah, that's what I'm saying, we only did this because our normal date was the holiday last week, so we kind of get it pushed.
Please don't do it on a Wednesday,
5:30?
or 3 o'clock.
Okay, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Okay, I apparently have a second too. All right, Joanne,
Yes?
Spiro?
Aye.
Myself, aye. John?
Yep.
George? Aye. Lee?
Yeah,
Mary?
aye.
Assuming she says aye. And Tom, looks like Tom Durkin out there. Tom?
He was on.
See his picture. Oh, there he is. He's muted. All right, thank you all. Sorry it ran late.